I was very fortunate that I went to China and I was there for so long that I got to grow up in a lot of ways. Like I learned to adult in China. Like I started as a student and I became a resident advisor and then a consultant. I was a business owner. I really had accomplished so much in Beijing in the 8 years that I had been there. It was so funny. I turned 32 this year and I felt like I was like 18 when I moved back last year. I had to get a car. Getting an apartment is so different in the US. You have to apply, you have to give references, like all of these things I had never done before. I'd never had an apartment in the US. I had never bought furniture in the US before. And so, yeah, a lot of little things having to learn. I remember even getting into my new job and learning office culture again and what it meant to have colleagues. Like boundaries are so different in the US. It's definitely a learning curve for sure.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to 北腔南调. I'm Melody.
I'm Victoria.
And today we will be talking about culture shock when you move to a new country or experience a new culture. We're going to talk about how to deal with reverse culture shock when you return home after a number of years overseas. And factors that contribute to culture shock can include climate, the language, social roles, values, relationships, and rules of behavior. So as somebody who's studied abroad in Europe and worked abroad in Asia, I've definitely experienced emotional and psychological distress when I'm initially placed in a new environment. So really excited to have this conversation today with Victoria and our guest, EJ, to talk about how each of us have experienced culture shock when we've gone to a new place, but also how we've adjusted back to the cultural expectations when we return back to our home countries.
Yeah, also as someone who studied and worked in Hong Kong for 2 years, I've been back to Beijing since 2013. This topic brings me some memory when I first arrived in Hong Kong. I can't speak Cantonese. I can't even ask for directions. So it's really challenging, difficult for living some other places. Today, we're excited to welcome the world traveler EJ to join us and to talk about his experience moving through the different stages of culture shock and how he's adjusted to these disoriented feelings over the years. So EJ was born and raised in Cincinnati, Ohio, and moved to China first in 2012, and then again in 2014. He stayed in China for 8 years and recently returned back to home to Ohio. Welcome, EJ.
Hi, thank you for having me. This is super exciting. Um, yeah, I guess a little bit about myself. I work as an educator, doing consulting work. I'm also on the board of a nonprofit that does college access work for students here in the US. And when I was in Beijing, I was also a part of a bar that was called 50/50. It's now called Rechill in the Sanlitun area. So if you're in Beijing, check it out. I think for me, I feel like culture shock can come in so many different ways. I think even sometimes it doesn't even take going to a different country. Sometimes it happens when you move to a new state for college, like I did, or things like that. And I've experienced it, of course, both in China and then coming back to the US.
Awesome. Super excited to hear about your story today, EJ. So let's start from the very beginning. Tell us about your journey and experience abroad. Coming from Ohio, what made you ultimately move across the world to be in Beijing, China for 8 years?
hmm Yeah, actually, I almost didn't go. So I went to school in Massachusetts for undergraduate, and I was an East Asian Studies major. So I was studying Mandarin in undergrad, and my first experience to go to China was actually to study abroad. I was a part of a pretty intensive a cappella group, and they actually looked down upon people studying abroad because you would miss one of the major performances. So I was really nervous about missing the singer show. All of my friends were in it. But I was like, this is a one in a lifetime opportunity. My school is paying for it, so I didn't really want to miss the opportunity to go abroad. So I did, and one semester turned into almost a decade worth of life experiences.
I know EJ in 2015. Right? So all this bring my memories back when I was first arriving in Hong Kong. Right? I carried a huge suitcase and was asking for directions on by a river, and there are a lot of old people there, and I can't listen. I don't understand Cantonese, and they don't understand Mandarin. And even when I speak Mandarin and asking for roles, they were like, walk away. I was like, oh my God, this is a place I'm gonna stay for at least 1 year. So I feel like part of that, like Beijing and Hong Kong are similar here, is like when you are a foreigner, you live in Beijing, you need to speak Chinese. And EJ's Chinese is one of the best Chinese I ever heard from like foreigners, because he used to send me like voice message and play a lot, and people are just like, no one gonna believe it that is from like a foreigner. So I think that's the part of reason like you move to China, so like to Beijing, instead like choosing Beijing over Shanghai.
Initially, yeah. So I thought my Mandarin was really good. I had studied for 2.5 years before I'd ever gone to Beijing. And I remember the first time I got to the airport and so I went to Beijing for a language intensive program. I think the Shanghai program was like more like business focused and it's more like culture study focused. I definitely wanted a language program. And I like got out of the airport and I got in a cab and I was like, I'm gonna crush this. Like, I'm so excited to tell the cab driver where I'm going. And of course, like the Chinese that you've learned in school is not really the Chinese that's like spoken in a place where most people are speaking it. So I get in the cab and he goes, 你吃什么地儿? And I was like, what? Like,
Like, I think we're missing a word.
And I was like, I'm 21 years old. And I just like started talking and I'm like, I'm American. And he goes, that's cool, but where are you going? And like it completely like I was like, oh my goodness, like what did I sign up for? Like did I make the wrong decision? So yeah, I mean like for me the first hit was definitely the language difference and like trying to navigate that and figuring that out even after, this is my major. It was like definitely a wake up call for me.
Absolutely. Textbook language is so different from the colloquial language that people actually use in real life. So, aside
Mhm.
from language, what were some other differences in terms of your expectations when you first went abroad versus what you actually experienced there?
Yeah, China's interesting in that at the time, so this was like a couple of years after Beijing had hosted the Olympics when I was like preparing to go abroad. Um, like I don't know, nothing in my a Chinese class is gonna really prepare you for like China is, right? In my mind, I thought everything was gonna be like the Hutongs, like this super like older, historic, like imperial sort of palace vibe. And obviously getting there, it was like, it's not that. Everything was bigger, everything was sort of louder. I felt like Beijing has this like I don't know, there's also this like serious undertone behind it. And so I think beyond like the language, it was getting used to just like the social dynamics, right? Just like large crowds everywhere, the way that like sort of friends engage with each other. Um, I think just like even like eating culture. I mean, like I went to China and this is embarrassing. Like I couldn't even use chopsticks. When I like signed up to study abroad in Beijing for a semester and I couldn't even use chopsticks. And so there were so many little things, like getting used to taking public transportation everywhere. Like I'm from the Midwest where we drive everywhere. So it was the big things to the small things across the board. There was so much to get used to initially.
So, what made you return back to China after your study abroad experience?
Honestly, I studied abroad and I got to live with a Chinese host family. And I think a big part of it is like being able to see China through their eyes. I don't think I had a super typical like study abroad student experience. I wasn't expecting to enjoy myself so much. And so it was really the connection with that family that made me think that like, okay, like I think I could do this one more time. Like let me try it again. So I ended up going back a second time to work for the study abroad program that I went through. Really had a positive experience there. Was only a year long situation, and then I got the opportunity to work at a school in the U.S. It wasn't exactly what I wanted, and I wanted to find an experience that was going to be able to combine like my passion for teaching and education, but also my degree and like my experiences with China, and something that was really people focused. I mean, like what I love so much about Beijing was like really the language and the people there, and so. Yeah, that's when I decided I was like, okay, as soon as the school year is over, I have to go back to Beijing. That was I made that decision in like the winter of 2014, and then like honestly like didn't look back until last year.
So you feel like how long it took you to get used to the life in Beijing?
I think until I felt like sort of super comfortable and just like integrated, I would say definitely close to about 6 months. I think even though I had like initially spent some time there, I think there's one thing to be like a student studying abroad, and then there's one thing to be a professional living abroad. So, I mean, like finding an apartment and like getting used to like having to travel to work and like that commute every single day, and like learning the subway system. Also, just like getting used to the community. I mean, I was very fortunate in my job. Like people were pretty social, and so I can make a lot of friends through work. But it was also, for me, it was really important to make friends locally, and so that was a big part of my like acclimation and integration process, was like actually putting my language skills to use and like getting outside of the expat bubble.
Yeah, I kind of like agree. 6 months is some like the same. I think around the same time I took to get used to like the life in Hong Kong. Like you start listening, understand people talking, and you know how to go
Mm-hmm.
to like supermarket, how to just do your daily routine life. How about you, Melody?
Mm-hmm.
Because you studied in Europe like before and worked in Asia. Is also a completely different environment for you.
Yeah. So my study abroad experience in Europe was really, really short. I went to a UC school and we're on quarter system. So I only studied abroad in Europe for a quarter, and mine was split between Italy and Spain. So I was really only in each country for 5 weeks. And so I just
Mm-hmm.
viewed that whole experience as I'm hanging out in Europe. So honestly, didn't even spend 5 weeks total in Italy because every weekend we would go to different countries. And same thing was when I was in Spain, I would just go to different places. So I don't think I fully acclimated to the experience of like living in Europe because I viewed that as kind of like a travel trip instead. But when I went to Beijing, China, I would say about half a year or even a full year because I'm from California on the West Coast. And so I've actually never really experienced seasons. So every time,
Mm-hmm.
spring came around, summer came around, fall came around, and then winter, when the snowstorm came, I was just shocked. And so I think seasonally, it took me a whole year to really experience all of that in Beijing. But in terms of getting used to transportation, the food, language, as well as just living over there, half a year, I would say.
So AJ, you stayed in Beijing for 8 years. Why did you decide to return home? And how's your experience being back home?
Mm-hmm. There are a lot of factors. I think for me, like I was very fortunate that like I went to China, and like I was there for so long that I got to grow up in a lot of ways. Like I learned to adult in China. Like I started as a student, and I became a resident advisor and then a consultant. I was a business owner. I really had accomplished so much in Beijing in the 8 years that I had been there. I come from a pretty big family. I have five brothers and sisters. And so when I had left to come back to Beijing, my youngest sister was 5. She's 14 now. I felt like I had missed out on a lot of their life, like my brother recently had a baby. I'm an uncle now. And so family was starting to feel like really important to me in my early 30s, in a way that like in my early 20s, I was like, yeah, whatever, like YOLO, do whatever I want to do. I think also, the last couple of years, like socially and politically in the US, have been really sort of intense. And so I wanted to find a way to sort of engage in sort of the issues that I felt were like important to me. Um, Also, I was like burnt out. I was doing really intensive work for a really long time. And I started with the company when it was like still in a pretty rapid growing phase, and sort of was with it through that growth, and before the pandemic hit. And so I think was starting to hit a wall. Like I never lost that initial like amazement and excitement about being in China. And I think when I started to hit burnout, I was like, oh, I'm not enjoying myself here anymore. And so I needed a change. I needed to take care of myself. And so it was a mixture of all of those things. Since being back, I'm not gonna lie, like right now I'm sort of in a year and a few months sort of into my time back in the US. I feel like I'm in a neutral positive space. But when I first came back, I was like, I hate it here. Like everything is trash. Like we have to start over. Like, did I make a horrible life decision? Like, like maybe I made sort of a rash choice in moving back during the pandemic, and I was sort of really, really um, Like I felt like I was even like going through a bit of identity crisis. And so it took a lot of time for me to like process like 8 years of being in China and like what meaning, if any, did that have, especially coming back to Ohio, um, a place where, there are a lot of international students here, but not as many local and American Ohioans. Like, most Ohioans don't even like leave Ohio, let alone travel to China. So initially it was really tough, but I really enjoyed being back and being closer to family. That's been really important to me and reconnecting with college friends and even seeing like my friends from China in the US for the first time. Like even that is a whole experience. So now it's pretty good. I'm here for it.
Yeah, we do have
See,
a lot of friends like coming back to like stay in China for 2 or 3 years and like they went back to the US. I think
Mm-hmm.
2 or 3 years is so different from 8 years. It's like long time your life. I think Beijing is like your second hometown, something like that. How do you feel about like the reverse culture shock challenges? How do you handle that when you come back home?
It was so funny. I mean, I turned 32 this year and I felt like I was like 18 when I moved back last year. Like I had to get a car. Like getting an apartment is so different in the US. You have to apply, you have to give references, like all of these things I had never done before. I'd never had an apartment in the US. I had never bought furniture in the US before. And so like there are a lot of little things I had to do. I have an older sister, and so like every day I would call her. I don't know if you've seen any of those memes of like, I don't know, calling your older sibling to like figure out a life situation. That was like totally me for the entire part coming back. Yeah, a lot of little things having to learn. I remember even like getting into my new job and like learning like office culture again and like what it meant to have colleagues. Like boundaries are so different in the US. Like people don't really want to be your friends. I felt like in the way that like my job in China did. So yeah, it was definitely a learning curve for sure.
yeah. I mean, you stated earlier, most of your adult life has been in China. And so coming back, there's so many different things that you have to experience. How has your experience abroad, though, benefited your return back home to Cincinnati?
I feel like at the most basic level, it's definitely a great conversation starter. I think that people are like more curious about China. I think people hear China in the news more in the US, much more than they did when I was growing up, and even when I was studying abroad. And so I think it definitely serves as a way, I think, to challenge people's sort of misconceptions or preconceptions of what they think China is. It's so funny when I tell people that I was in China, they're always like, "What? Really?" And then I'm like, yeah. And they're like, how long? And I tell them, and they're like, what? And they're like, how was it? And almost every single person is surprised when I tell them that I enjoy being in China, which I think, for whatever reason, media, whatever, you can blame it on whatever, education, but it's great because I think that like it makes people sort of question what they think they know about China and the fact that, me, being a minority and being Black in China, I think people are surprised that I could have such positive experience to stay there. So that's been great. I think professionally, it's also been great. I feel like I'm in a place where I have such a wide skill set and a language set and a culture set that I can apply in a lot of different places. So it's definitely helped me in that. I think it's also been interesting because as I think about like my long-term future goals, I'm still trying to figure out like where does China fit? Like with this China puzzle, like sometimes I'm like, oh, it would be such a shame if I didn't like continue using my Mandarin and work and things like that. But I'm also at a place where I'm like, maybe it's time to pivot. And could I go into something else and sort of yeah, trying to make sense of like how China fits into sort of my 5 years when I'm not there.
So, do you ever feel homesick for China?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, definitely in the beginning, I felt like I was living a double life. I would like, wake up and like do my job in the US. And then at night, when all my friends in China was awake, I was like, get on the phone, please. I was like trying to call and connect with everyone. So I definitely miss it. Um, I, I do really miss hearing like Beijing Hua every day. Like I just really love, which I think some people think is silly, but like I miss the Beijing accent. Um
I'll send you
I miss
more
just like,
voice message.
yes, yes, please. I miss like some of the hustle and bustle of the city. I mean, like Beijing is such an energetic place, and there's always something going on. There's so many different pockets. Not to say that there isn't that here, but there's just the scale and the magnitude of it is different. So I miss my friends. Yeah, I miss like, I don't know, the people who would get together and like, have the beers and the baija with their friends over the summer. I think there's like such these interesting pockets of community that I definitely miss for sure. How could I not, you know?
How about Melly? You left, you spent like 3 or 4 years in Beijing and you left this year, right? Like in April. So how do you feel?
I definitely miss the excitement, the energy of Beijing, just like what EJ said earlier, because Taiwan is just it's much slower paced and it's very comfortable here. My family is here, but yeah, the energy in Beijing is just on a whole other level. But
Hmm.
I
Hmm.
also am similar with EJ in the sense that like being there for so long, I did feel a little burnt out. So
Yeah.
that is the initial reason why I left. Now looking back, I'm like, oh, that was really exciting. But I feel like if I were to be placed in that environment again for an extensive period of time, I would feel burnt out again. So I miss it. I would want to visit. Not so sure if I would want to live there again
Yeah,
for long
yeah, I
term.
definitely feel that way. Yeah, I'm learning to like enjoy the slower pace of life. I think like my nervous system hasn't known like peace and quiet, and so I think like my body and my nervous system thinks it's weird. But yeah, I think I'm in a place where like yeah, like the slower pace of life, the ease is nice.
Yeah, it's just comfortable right now. Very nice.
Hmm.
Yeah, I had a conversation with a group of friends on like the Friendsgiving on Saturday night. They were talking about like going back to US. They can imagine like when they are in Beijing, right? They're in Beijing right now. So they can imagine if they go back to the US, they can go out for dinner, for lunch, every meal. And they don't know how to do like EJ said, they probably need to buy a car and they don't need here, right? They just call a cab and you could go everywhere. And the subway is so well developed. A lot of people are considering going back to their home country.
Yeah.
And do you have any tips for them to overcoming culture shock and all the challenges they're gonna face?
Yeah, I mean, you bring up a really good point. That for me, the change in lifestyle initially was like pretty drastic. You can't really brace yourself for it until you're like really in it, because I don't think you really know, especially if you're someone like me who stayed for such a long time. Like you're so used to just like doing things a certain way, and like all of that has changed. So definitely be prepared for like shifts in lifestyle. Um, I would say like really assess like what type of community that you want. I'm from Ohio, but I haven't really lived here since I was a teenager. So like none of my friends live in the state anymore. So I was moving back to a place where there was family but no friends. And so I had to like, you have to be really intentional about the type of community that you're going to build. What type of friends do you want to have? Are they available in the place that you're at? And if not, like are you okay with online communities? Maybe it's time to build a new hobby, get a dog. That's what I did. So I think you have to find new ways to keep yourself not necessarily busy, but like to keep yourself interested and keep yourself doing things that sort of make you happy. I think especially in a space where there's so much change going on. Find a friend who I think you can like vent to, someone who isn't going to like be upset that you're the person to be like, oh, but in like China, it was this way, like fortunately, like my sister was that person for me. It was totally okay for me, like going back and forth and comparing until I got over that. Honestly, sometimes technology can be great. And like I said, like I would spend my mornings and evenings in two different time zones. But like sometimes I think it is good to unplug and find reasons to like keep yourself happy and excited about what's happening in your like moment and sort of in the present. I think otherwise, like I don't know, I think you sort of like split your brain up too much. So figuring those things out, I think especially if you can before you leave, can be really helpful to smooth out that transition. I also read a really great book. It was called like Transitions by William Bridges. I didn't read through all of it, but it was really, really nice and sort of like framing sort of the difference between a life change and a life transition. And most of us treat transitions as changes. And like that's why we experience so much difficulties.
Any tips from you, Melody? Because you've been back to Taiwan for more than half a year, right? So it's like 7, 8 months already.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Listening to EJ, I'm just like vigorously nodding my head. Yeah, just coming back to Taiwan. My family is here. And so I really wanted to come back, but I had to redevelop relationships with friends who are constantly coming in and out, right? So figuring
Mhm.
out where I'm going to have that community outside, finding new hobbies, developing a completely new relationship with the city and country that you're now in is very important. It's going to take time, just like how it takes like 6 months to a year for you to adjust to that initial country that you went to study abroad in or work abroad in. It's going to take probably just as much time to go back to your home country because
Mhm.
things have changed so much since you've been gone. People's mindset has moved on and their
Mhm.
relationships have changed as well. And so then just like kind of figuring out where you fit into that puzzle.
EJ, do you have any plans to leave home and go abroad again?
I would definitely love to go on a vacation, traveling internationally is always great. It's really hard for me to imagine myself right now. I think like making plans to move back into China long term. I don't know. I have lived in a different place every year. Like even in college, I was in a different dorm every year. In Beijing, I was in a different apartment every year. I like really want to stay put. I don't know why I like have this like habit and pattern of moving around, but I really want to stay put. So probably not. But we'll
Have
see.
some
I don't know.
stability in your life, huh?
Yeah, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
yeah,
EJ's
Yeah.
tired.
yeah.
Well, EJ, is there anything else you would like to share with us today or any other tips that you'd like to share on overcoming reverse culture shock?
Yeah, I would say definitely have a good sense of humor. Like you have to be able to laugh at yourself. I think there are some things that will just be like super silly that will come up. You can't take anything too seriously. Um, I would say if you have a chance, if you're listening, you haven't gone abroad, go see China for yourself, make up your own opinions and conclusions, and go somewhere and learn to cook something. That's one of my biggest regrets. I never learned to cook Chinese food like well. So
It's hard. It's hard when
yeah,
YMI is so accessible.
Oh, yeah.
yeah. Mm. So learn to cook something, have a good attitude, and yeah, thank you all for having me. This has been so much fun.
Thank
Yeah.
you. Well, we still have 3 questions at the end to ask
Ooh.
EJ. So, number one, how do you feel right now?
Warm and happy. Yeah.
That's
Amazing.
so, yeah, that's so nice. Yeah. What is something you are grateful for today?
Mm. Today, I got to spend the whole day with my niece. It was the first time I've gotten to do that since March. So that was really special.
Oh,
I don't know when I'll see her again. So, yeah.
What are you energized about?
I have been working on a family history project. I've done a bunch of DNA tests and things like that and have been connecting dots. And so I recently started interviewing some of my older family members and like collecting stories. So that's been like really fun and really exciting to learn my family history and reconnect with my family in a way that I never thought I could before. So that's been really energizing, very fun and exciting.
That's so cool.
yeah.
You know, it's
Yeah.
because like we oftentimes only know our parents, our uncles, aunties as like who they are. Like they're our
Mm-hmm.
mom, our aunts,
Mm-hmm.
right? But it's like,
Mm-hmm.
no, they had a life before us too. It's like, who were they beforehand and what were their relationships like before they were with, our uncle?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yeah, absolutely. I mean, like we totally forget that our parents were fully people before us. Like by
Right.
my age, my dad was married with 4 kids. Like I couldn't imagine that. So yeah, it's been super fun hearing their stories and little wisdoms about life. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, EJ, for joining us today to have this fun conversation on culture shock and reverse culture shock. To all our listeners, thank you for tuning into this episode. Stay tuned on Wednesdays for more conversations with fun guests, and we'll chat soon. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.